On the night of July 6, 1988, 120 miles off the coast of Aberdeen, a single missing piece of paper killed 167 men. This is what happened. Piper Alpha was the largest single producer of oil and gas in the United Kingdom sector of the North Sea. 10% of British North Sea production passed through this one platform. By the morning of July 7th, it no longer existed. This is Post-Mortem. We don't sensationalize, we reconstruct. Tonight, the deadliest offshore accident in history, and the chain of small, ordinary, fixable decisions that produced it. Piper Alpha began producing oil in December 1976. It was operated by Occidental Petroleum of Caledonia, a subsidiary of the American firm Occidental, owned at the time by Arm & Hammer. The platform sat in roughly 144 meters of water on the Piper Field, a major oil discovery of the early 1970s. The structure was a fixed steel jacket platform with 4 main modules stacked on a steel substructure. Module A held the wellheads, Module B housed the separation equipment, where oil, gas, and water were divided, Module C contained the gas compression equipment, and Module D was for power generation and utilities. Above the production modules sat the accommodation block, where on any given night around 226 men slept, ate, watched television, and waited for the helicopter that would take them home. I want you to notice something about that layout. The accommodation block, where the men slept, was directly above the modules that processed oil and gas. In 1976, when the platform was built, this was acceptable. The original design assumed that any fire in the production modules would be relatively small and contained. The firewalls between modules were designed to handle oil fires, not gas explosions. By 1988, the platform had been modified to handle gas as well as oil. The firewalls had not been upgraded. This is the first piece of background you need. The men slept above the gas plant. The wall between them was designed for a different platform. On the afternoon of July 6th, 2 condensate pumps were the focus of routine attention. Their job was to compress liquid hydrocarbon, condensate, and move it through the pipeline system. One pump, designated Pump A, was undergoing scheduled maintenance. A pressure safety valve had been removed for recertification. The pump itself was offline, and a blank flange had been temporarily installed where the valve would normally sit. The valve was sitting on a workbench. It would not be reinstalled before the end of the day shift. The crucial detail. The work was logged on a permit to work, a formal document used across the platform to track maintenance and ensure that equipment is not started up while it is being serviced. A separate permit existed for a different planned job on the same pump, a long-running maintenance task that would not resume until the next morning. At shift change, around 6 in the evening, the day shift maintenance team had a problem. They could not find the night shift supervisor responsible for Pump A. The man was busy elsewhere on the platform. The day shift man, following standard practice, placed the permit for the missing valve work in the control room. The official inquiry would later find that the permit was placed in a location where the night shift supervisor should have seen it, but that the formal handover conversation about that specific permit did not take place. The shift changed. The men who knew that Pump A's safety valve was missing went off duty. The men coming on duty did not have that information clearly in front of them. One piece of paper, one missing conversation. At around 9:45 p.m., the secondary condensate pump, Pump B, failed. It tripped offline. Without condensate pumping, the gas compression system would, within minutes, shut down on a low pressure alarm. That shutdown would have to be reported to onshore management as lost production. The on-duty operator made the only decision he believed he had. He started Pump A. At approximately 21:58, Pump A came online with a critical piece of safety equipment missing. Pressurized gas condensate escaped from the open flange where the pressure safety valve should have been. A small but rapidly growing cloud of explosive vapor began to form inside Module C, the gas compression module. Within seconds, and seconds is the right unit here, the cloud reached an ignition source. The first explosion blew out the firewall between Module C and Module B. The firewall between Modules B and C had been designed in 1976 to contain an oil fire. It was not rated for a gas explosion. When it failed, the explosion's shock wave entered Module B, where the separation equipment was. Pipework ruptured. Crude oil began to feed the fire. Within roughly 20 minutes, the platform's main oil line had failed. Within roughly 22 minutes, gas was venting from the broken risers that connected Piper Alpha to two other platforms upstream, Tartan and Claymore. And here we reach the second decision the inquiry would later focus on. When Piper Alpha caught fire, the other platforms on the same pipeline system did not shut down their production. The control rooms on Tartan and Claymore did not have the authority to do so unilaterally. They could see Piper Alpha burning on the horizon. They could see on their instruments the rising pressure feeding the fire. They contacted onshore management. They were instructed to continue pumping. The official inquiry concluded that the gas continuing to flow from Tartan in particular dramatically intensified the Piper Alpha fire and contributed to the catastrophic loss of the platform. Now we have to go inside. At the moment of the first explosion, most of the off-duty crew were in the accommodation block. Many were watching a film. Some were in their bunks. Some were eating. The block, designed as a refuge, was about to become the worst place on the platform. The emergency procedure was for the men to gather in the accommodation block and await evacuation by helicopter or lifeboat. The procedure assumed the helideck would be accessible and the lifeboats reachable. By the time the alarms reached the accommodation areas, the fire was already between the men and the lifeboats. The helideck was rapidly becoming unreachable through smoke and heat. The standing instruction was to stay put. Many of the men followed it. The smoke filling the accommodation block was, by some accounts, fatal within minutes for those who remained. What saved the survivors was not the procedure. What saved them was that some of the men made an individual decision to ignore it. They climbed down. In some cases, they jumped from heights of more than 50 meters into water that was on fire. The survivors of Piper Alpha are almost without exception men who chose to disobey the standing instruction to remain in the accommodation block. That is one of the hardest sentences in the entire official inquiry to absorb. In the water around Piper Alpha that night was a standby vessel, the Silver Pit, required by regulation to be on station and prepared to recover men from the sea. There were also two fast rescue craft launched from other vessels in the area, and the firefighting and support vessel Tharos, which arrived during the disaster. The Tharos was equipped with water cannons, a hospital module, and the ability to extend a gangway to the platform. At a specific point in the disaster, the Theros maneuvered close enough to extend its mechanical gangway toward Piper Alpha. Before the gangway could be deployed and used, a second major explosion, caused by the failure of one of the gas risers from Tartan, sent the Theros into a defensive retreat. The gangway never connected. Men who might have crossed it did not. The fast rescue craft launched from Silver Pit and other vessels did extraordinary work. The crews of these small boats made repeated passes into burning water to retrieve men who had jumped or climbed down. The official record credits the small boat crews with the recovery of dozens of survivors under conditions that no procedure had prepared them for. If you want to understand what professional courage looks like, the deck logs of the Silver Pit and the Sandhaven, whose fast rescue craft was lost when a second explosion hit it, are the relevant documents. At approximately 22:50, around 52 minutes after the first explosion, the Tartan gas riser failed catastrophically. The volume of gas suddenly released was enormous. The official inquiry described this as the moment after which the destruction of the platform became inevitable. The fireball reached the Tharos, scorching paint, melting equipment, forcing the vessel back to a distance of nearly 2 miles. On the platform itself, the structural steel of the lower modules began to fail. At approximately 23:18, the eastern crane and other upper structures collapsed into the sea. At approximately 23:20, the accommodation block, weakened by the heat below it, broke free and fell. Of the men still in it, almost none survived. By midnight, the structural steel that had held Piper Alpha out of the water for 12 years was failing across every load-bearing section. By the early hours of July 7th, the platform that had produced 10% of the United Kingdom's North Sea oil and gas was a partially submerged ruin. 167 men died. 165 of them were on or near Piper Alpha. 2 were crew of the fast rescue craft from the Sandhaven, killed when a falling object struck their boat. 61 men survived. The vast majority of them owed their survival to the fact that they did not stay in the accommodation block. Of the dead, 30 bodies were never recovered. The remains of the accommodation block, with most of those men still inside it, was eventually located on the seabed. In 1989, a salvage operation lifted the block from the seafloor. The bodies recovered from it were brought home. The names of all 167 men are inscribed on the Piper Alpha Memorial in the North Sea Memorial Rose Garden in Hazelhead Park, Aberdeen. The garden was dedicated in July 1991. The financial losses were enormous. The human losses, beyond accounting. But the most important thing produced by the Piper Alpha disaster was a question. How does an industry that knew this was possible let it happen anyway? The answer to that question came in the form of a man named William Cullen. Lord Cullen, William Douglas Cullen, was appointed to lead the public inquiry into the disaster. The inquiry sat from November 1988 to February 1990. It heard from hundreds of witnesses. It produced a 2-volume report in November 1990 containing 106 recommendations. Every single one of those recommendations was accepted by the operators and the regulator. The Cullen report is, in my view, one of the great pieces of disaster forensics ever produced. It identified the technical cause, a missing safety valve combined with an ignition source. It identified the procedural cause, a failed permit to work handover. It identified the structural cause, firewalls inadequate for gas service. It identified the operational cause, the failure of upstream platforms to shut down. But Cullen went further. He identified the cultural cause, a management system in which production was implicitly prioritized over safety, a regulatory regime in which the same body was responsible for both maximizing oil production and ensuring safety, a conflict of interest, Cullen wrote, that was not survivable. The most consequential of Cullen's recommendations was structural. He recommended that responsibility for offshore safety regulation be removed from the Department of Energy, the same department responsible for promoting North Sea production, and transferred to the Health and Safety Executive. This was done. He recommended that operators be required to produce, for each installation, a safety case, a comprehensive document demonstrating that all major hazards had been identified, assessed, and reduced as far as reasonably practicable. This became and remains the foundation of the modern offshore safety regime in the UK. Other jurisdictions adopted similar systems. The safety case approach, which had existed in nuclear contexts, became standard practice across high-hazard industries worldwide. When I read the Cullen report, the section that has always stayed with me is not the technical chapters. It is the chapter on culture. Cullen describes an environment in which workers had legitimate safety concerns that they did not raise through formal channels, not because they were lazy or indifferent, but because they believed, reasonably, that raising them would damage their relationships with supervisors and their continued employment. The permit to work system on Piper Alpha was not unusual. It existed because the industry knew, in principle, that controlling who works on what equipment is the single most important administrative safety task. What failed was not the existence of the system, it was the use of the system. At the day-night shift change of July 6th, the formal handover of the permit for Pump A's missing safety valve did not happen as it should have, because the procedure assumed a verbal conversation that did not happen. Procedures that depend on verbal conversations at busy shift changes will, at some point, depend on a conversation that does not happen. One of the deepest lessons of Piper Alpha is that resilient safety systems do not assume the best version of a busy human being. They assume the worst on a Friday night, on the day before a holiday, at the end of a 14-hour shift. After Piper Alpha, permit-to-work systems across high-hazard industries were redesigned with formal sign-offs, electronic tracking, and explicit verification steps. The shift handover became a structured event with a checklist, not a conversation in a corridor. Every year on July 6th, in Aberdeen, in Sunderland, in towns across the United Kingdom and beyond, the families of the men of Piper Alpha gather. So do the survivors. They are now men in their 60s and 70s. They speak, when they choose to speak, with extraordinary precision about the night they climbed down. The offshore industry that exists today is not the offshore industry that existed on July 5th, 1988. The platforms are different, the procedures are different, the regulatory structure is different. The cultural assumption that production overrides safety has been, in most jurisdictions, formally inverted. None of this happened because the industry, on its own, decided to do better. It happened because 167 men died on one night, and one judge insisted that the only acceptable response was structural change. That is the truth that Post-Mortem returns to again and again. Disasters of this magnitude are not punished by regulators in advance. They are punished by physics in arrears. And the people who pay are almost never the people who designed the procedures. The men of Piper Alpha are remembered in Hazelhead Park in Aberdeen. If you ever pass through that city, the garden is worth a quiet hour. Thank you for sitting with this one. If reconstructions like this matter to you, subscribe. The channel is here for them.